Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Machines in Medicine, a podcast from Syntegon. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Moody. Today, we're talking about parenteral drugs, otherwise known as medicines injected into the body. Close your eyes, that is, if you're not driving, and imagine an injection. Now open your eyes. I bet the majority of you had a specific device in mind, a syringe. We'll be talking about syringes, injections, and the evolution of parenteral drugs with my guest, Mathias Romacker. Mathias is a Kymanox executive advisor with more than 30 years of experience in the field of injectable drug device delivery. He brings a deep understanding of prefilled syringes, handheld injection devices, and on-body wearable devices, having been involved in multiple successful combination product launches. Mr. Romacker has been a co-chair for the Parenteral Drug Association, otherwise known as PDA, Universe of Prefilled Syringes and Injection Devices in 2013, 2017, 2019, and most recently 2022. And he received the PDA Edward Smith Packaging Science Award in 2018 for his contributions over the years. Welcome, Mathias, and thank you for joining Machines in Medicine.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Laura. Happy to be here.
Great. So we have listeners from every walk of life. Let's start by defining a few terms before we dive deeper into the details. So first off, what does parenteral mean? That's not a word that we use typically in our everyday life.
Yeah, it's indeed a unique word, and to be honest, it became also part of my active vocabulary once I actually started working in the industry. Parenteral in that context would basically mean all things injectable, right? So if it's an injectable, it is going to be delivered, if you want, via the invasive route. So it means you have to penetrate a skin barrier. And then, of course, there's different routes like intravenous, subcutaneous, intramuscular, and a few others. So in a nutshell, parenteral drugs are invasively delivered drugs. And again, there's multiple routes of delivery.
All right, great. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So secondly, how do you define prefilled syringes? Why do we use the phrase prefilled syringe instead of simply syringe when we're talking about these types of devices?
That's a great question. And prefilled syringes are an amazing success story. If you would go back 30 years into the past, you actually didn't see so many prefilled syringes. So in a nutshell, again, a syringe is used to administer drugs, often intramuscular, subcutaneous, and intravenous. And if the syringe is pre-filled, that means that the drug is filled into the syringe by the pharmaceutical manufacturer, and it's in the syringe during storage, and then you dispense from the syringe directly into the patient. And obviously, that concept has a lot of advantages versus having an injectable drug in a vial. When you have to transfer, things can go wrong in terms of dosing. You have more dead space, hence drug wastage. So again, it's quite an impressive list. Why prefilled syringes have a lot of advantages over previous or more conventional systems like vials and ampoules.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect transition to my next question for you here. So I know that most liquid medicines bound for injection have historically been available in a vial, at least here in North America, elsewhere around the world. You mentioned ampoules as well. So patients would visit a practitioner in a medical setting, and then the provider would then transfer a specific dose from vial to syringe for administration at point of use. My question for you is, when were the first medicines available already packaged in a syringe, pre-filled? And can you share anything about the who, what, why that made this transition happen?
Indeed. So as things are often in life, disruption happens in a maybe not so intuitive way. So my first job was with Becton Dickinson, BD, and I worked with a division called Pharmaceutical Systems, which really 30 years ago was a very small division within BD. Anecdotally, I even heard the CEO wasn't aware of it. And they started producing prefilled syringes in one site in Grenoble in France. And so the first customers were actually France-based, but they were also customers like in Spain or Ireland. And the two big therapeutic areas that actually drove this initial need were vaccines, and they still are today, and heparins, anticoagulants. And the interesting point is that for both therapies, they're usually administered by healthcare professionals. So this is kind of, if you want, the starting point. And companies that actually used them were like Rhône Poulenc, Mérieux, Pasteur. So all companies that are now, if you want, it disappeared. Many of them are within Sanofi now, but those were the days 30 years ago.
So the next step in the evolution of, maybe we call it a patient-centered drug administration, has been the development of auto-injectors and pen injectors. Maybe you can tell our listeners how these two technologies differ and how they're alike.
Yes, when you ask me about auto-injectors and pen injectors, to be honest, the terminology is a bit all over the place. But in this context, I would make the case that an auto-injector is typically based on a prefilled syringe. And when we talk a prefilled syringe, that typically means you have a fixed dose and you're going to dispense the entire fixed dose. So that in a certain way would be an auto-injector. And the pen injectors typically would use cartridges, glass cartridges in most cases. And often they would go into an insulin pen with insulin pen needles. And you would typically dispense multiple doses out of that cartridge, so multiple injections. And many of those therapies would also be variable dosing. Obviously, in diabetes, it depends on the blood glucose level of the patient, weight of the patient. And in other areas like human growth hormones or fertility, it depends again on the size of usually a child or the female who undergoes IVF therapy. Again, this is very short. We could talk about this much more, and we will, but I hope this kind of sets the stage.
Yeah, that's great. It hits close to home. I have a son who has a nut allergy, so we have EpiPens or auto-injectors all over the house. And I do know that it's a single administration, a whole dose of epinephrine would be delivered if he needed it, but thankfully we've escaped that thus far. Great, thank you for that. So I want to talk a little bit about the drug development process. So pharmaceutical manufacturers at some point in the process need to decide how a specific drug is going to be administered. So what's the rationale that goes into this decision-making process, and when does the decision have to be made, whether it's going to be packaged within a vial, in a prefilled syringe, in an auto-injector or pen injector? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Obviously, we're talking about pipeline products here. And if you want to start from scratch, you typically know that you work on a parenteral drug, an injectable. But now, of course, you have to look at kind of dosing. You start, obviously, clinical trials first in human. And this is when it becomes already quite interesting, right? For instance, let's say you have a chronic therapy. You expect that maybe an MS or a rheumatoid arthritis patient would be using this drug basically for life, right? So now you know, okay, I have a self-injecting patient. So now go back and look at my drug, and then I look, okay, what would be possible doses? Do I have a lower dose? Do I have a higher dose? If it's a higher dose, maybe I can concentrate. But if I concentrate the drug more, then my drug gets more viscous. So just on a very high level, those are quite a few questions you have to look at coming right out of the gate. Then, of course, there's the communication piece within a pharma. So you have a lot of different functions involved, right? You got your researchers, your development people, your formulation people, and then, of course, the device people. So I must say, over the years, I was also sometimes a little bit surprised when a new drug came and you ask, oh, it's in a prefilled syringe. And you ask, so why actually? Nobody could really answer you that question. So in a certain way, it's really a good thing that you actually start having that conversation at a very early stage across multiple functions. And to be honest, I think that pharma has really advanced over the years, that they actually understand that this is really something that should be part of the process, how to really optimize the value of an asset.
Yeah, lessons learned from previous experience. Now, are there any specific therapeutic areas that are key drivers for pre-filled syringe growth?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned, of course, vaccines and heparins, so anticoagulants, and they were here to stay. So there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of vaccines, at least in developed markets, are presented in prefilled syringes. So the interesting story really with the rise of prefilled syringes is biologics. So there's a lot of drugs actually evolved, I would say, in the last 20 years. And they're like monoclonal antibodies, proteins, and also the therapies would be for chronic diseases. I mentioned before MS, I mentioned RA, but I think dermatological indications like psoriasis or atopic dermatitis. There's, of course, the GI therapies for UC and Crohn's disease. And there's even now anti-migraine drugs that are also biologics.
Yes, I've seen those.
Yeah, and they're actually monthly shots. So you can clearly see that a lot of those products actually are for chronic treatments, right? You want to make sure that the patient is adherent, because you have to ask patients to self-inject, and you really want to provide them the right tools. And it starts with a prefilled syringe. And in a certain way, we talked already about auto-injectors, which really help patients to make each and every administration event hopefully successful.
What kind of prefilled syringes are more prevalent when it comes to packaging? Bulk prefilled syringes or pre-sterilized prefilled syringes? I know we're seeing that the prevalence of ready-to-use containers growing in the primary packaging arena. But from your point of view, which kind are more prevalent, the bulk or pre-sterilized prefilled syringes? And a follow-up to that is, what does that mean for the processing and packaging of sterile medicines? How the components are delivered to a packaging machine?
Yeah, great question. And I also concur with your first conclusion that the pre-sterilized syringes, and lately actually vials as well, seem to become the container of choice for the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the advantages are very obvious, right? That you get pre-sterilized containers, usually in tubs, and then you just introduce those into an aseptic core to fill and stopper them. At the very early onset of prefilled syringes in the 90s, there were actually some manufacturers that would use bulk syringes, which means they came unsterilized, and they would go through all the processes like washing them, siliconizing them, sterilizing them. But this really only became a thing for very high volume manufacturers. And interestingly enough, many of those also would actually switch to pre-sterilized. And to conclude this question, I recall a conversation last year with one of the big pharmas, and they said, look, I mean, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We want to switch our entire injectable portfolio to pre-sterilized containers.
That's really interesting. I think you're shifting the responsibility of cleaning and sterilization to the component supplier instead of the pharmaceutical manufacturer, so that they're taking that risk out of their process by shifting it onto the syringe manufacturer. So a follow-up to that last question, what did the tremendous growth of prefilled syringes and devices mean for machine makers like Syntegon? So you saw the equipment landscape in the early 2000s. Where were we then? And how are the machine makers supporting the success story of today?
I think the machine makers coming in there and evolving was one of the major actually milestones to make this all successful. In the very early stages, I remember that stoppers would be nested, and and you would use, I think it was a company called Cosoli. I'm not sure they still exist. So they had a very manual operation. So you had like two operators. I think at best they could manufacture, fill and stopper 4,000 to 5,000 syringes in an hour. So, I mean, this is great for clinical batches, but for commercial manufacturing, I mean, you can see that this would result in very high cost. Even the unit cost for prefilled syringes back in the day was way higher than it is today in today's dollars or euros. So what really happened was that the fill finish and stoppering and further processing, maybe assembling and auto injectors, became highly automated. And I don't know the exact numbers, but my understanding is that some of the high-speed equipment can fill 30, 40,000 syringes in 1 hour. It probably helps that the biggest chunk of prefilled syringes is 1 ml doses or a little bit lower, right? So it's smaller volume. So the filling goes super fast. But I can only encourage all the listeners, if you have an opportunity to see manufacturing, it is really mind-boggling fast now. So machine makers from introduction into an aseptic core, filling, stoppering, inspecting, packaging, or maybe assembly into an auto injector or pen injector, it has come a long way. And from my understanding is that the unit cost to process those containers has come down tremendously.
Yeah, I bet that will continue on in the future as well. All right, so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here. I understand that you're one of the co-founders of PDA's Universe of Pre-Filled Syringes event, the first event being held in 2004. Can you tell me a little bit about how this idea came about?
So if I go back to 2004, I recall that there was not a single conference worldwide that would have the prefilled syringe as a topic, as a main focus. So we were some PDA members that had the conversation, said, look, let's reach out to PDA leadership. And this is exactly how the PDA operates. I mean, you have members initiating things. So we reached out and said, look, we are quite confident that if we were to organize a conference around this topic, that people would really come and be interested. So we organized the first conference in 2004 in Hanover, and we projected like 60, 80 people, and the conference hotel could hold up to 100, and we had to turn people away. So as you can imagine, it was a big success. And I also want to mention that we had at this first event, we already invited machine makers to present, and they came, as we felt this was a very important part of the overall conversation, how to really make this whole thing a success, prefilled syringes and growth.
So a few years after its inception, I know that the term injection devices was added to the PDA Universe of Prefilled Syringes conference title. So why was that decision made?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what happened with this conference? First of all, the year after in 2005, it was in Munich, and we had already over 250 people. And then we noticed also a lot of people would come from the US. So the PDA made the decision that the conference should be alternating between the US and Europe. So the year after, it was over in the US, I think in Las Vegas. And then since then, we always go Europe, US. And the injection device title, that was actually, that came fairly early. And one reason is that in 2006, and this is during my Amgen years, pretty much at the same time, Amgen, and back then it was Abbott, now AbbVie, launched Enbrel and Humira respectively in prefilled syringe-based auto-injectors. And a lot of launches have happened since. And again, many of them for self-injected drugs or typically. So from the PDA perspective, they realized having a prefilled syringe just in isolation, it didn't really make much sense because it really became the primary container of choice for device technologies. So hence we added injection devices. And also if you talk injection devices, you're also covering topics with like injection pens that are cartridge based, or like wearable injectors or on-body injectors that have different kind of primary containers.
I think that it was a wonderful addition to the conference, and I'm sure the amount of content that is shared at those conferences just improved as you included those topics as well to the conference agenda. Now, over the years of the PDA Universe of Prefilled Syringes and Injection Devices Conference, do any milestones stand out? Did you see any new market entrants? And if you did, were those driven by regulations or by competition?
Yeah, it's actually all of the above. And this is a great question because it is one of those nice things when you have some disruption happening, how it actually keeps evolving. And one interesting thing was in, like, I would say late 2000s, that all of a sudden human factors engineering became a huge topic. So in a nutshell, that means that regulatory bodies, they want to see when you actually file a submission for a device, that there are no reoccurring patterns of patients getting it wrong. So some people also call it usability studies. So that became a whole new discipline, and all pharmas or also suppliers, they have now really quite a few employees who specialize in human factors engineering. So that became a big thing, and I remember we had whole sessions at the Universe discussing that topic. Lots of it when it was new, a little bit less, obviously, moving forward when it became a routine. And another kind of, if you want, cottage niche that evolved was patient onboarding. So we also got new players that were basically developing and designing reusable demo devices. And it's not an easy task, right? Because you really have to tell a patient, okay, now you're injecting yourself. I mean, usually people don't like that news. And now how do you make it palatable? And this whole onboarding industry really supports, obviously, maybe the initial kind of take, okay, I got to learn this, and also really how to get it right. And now, fasting forward, obviously, connectivity is becoming a bigger topic. It's still evolving. We're still having conversations about the value proposition. But my personal take is that this is going to happen.
Oh, that's a perfect way to take me to my final question for you today. A look into the future, a look ahead. So in your view, where is the future headed for patient-centered drug administration, and what might that mean for our industry?
Let me share with you one other observation here first. When you look at the potential for prefilled syringes or devices overall, one interesting driver actually is that there's now more drugs that were usually given via the intravenous route, infusions, obviously, into the vein, are moving into subcutaneous injections. And there's quite a few examples lately. You have Remicade or Entyvio available in auto-injectors in the EU. And in the US, there are some oncology drugs like Herceptin or Avastin that also became available as subcutaneous versions. The list is actually much bigger. So if listeners are very interested, by all means, contact me. Happy to have that conversation. And so I think that is also one big driver, right? So you're moving therapy from a clinical setting to a home setting. And you can also imagine there's obviously convenience on the patient side, but also it's kind of attractive for payers, right? Because obviously getting work done in a clinical setting is very expensive, as it should be. So here's one driver. And the other driver, I think, is frankly that, especially with those chronic therapies, and now pretty much everybody having smartphones, including the boomers. So this is, I mean, how can your self-injection experience, or how you actually have your patient journey, if you want, how could that be disconnected really from from all your other activities. And one activity is obviously really being on your phone, logging things, etc. So I personally see an opportunity there that, first of all, you can interact with patients, healthcare providers, but also you could, for instance, have for patients to really be adherent, it can become another tool for doctors, for physicians to help managing them. And one thing could be, for instance, if a patient misses an injection, and that's very human, that you could have individualized reminders that you could just kind of place a call or send messages. And also at the end of the year, you could sit together with your physician and review, obviously, how you're doing health-wise, but also how your administration of the prescribed drug and dose, how that is going. And if you talk about drugs that are variable doses, there's now a newer technology out there that is typically attached to an insulin pens. And one company I can mention in that context is Biocorp, and they partner with the big three in insulin, where you logging the day, the time, and the dose of insulin delivered. And I could also imagine that this would be a great tool moving forward to make sure that patients are usually in that sweet spot if it comes to their blood sugar.
We have so much to gain by the data that we're able to generate from patients, capturing it on our phones. Like you said, adherence, I can imagine, will only increase. And also the researchers looking at this data and seeing patient outcomes and how it might correspond with usage of medications can really allow for some good future planning for future drugs or future dosages of certain medications. So why not use the data that we're capturing for the benefit of all?
Absolutely.
So now is time for a little bit of fun. We always end every episode of Machines in Medicine with some trivia. So I have a question for you today. We'll see what you know about original company names. Probably nothing. So it's okay to not get it right because I had no idea about this when I found it. So what company was originally called Cadabra? This is a company that everybody knows across the world, but it was originally known as Cadabra for 2 short years in its inception.
What kind of lifelines do you offer?
None. No lifelines.
I can't ask a friend. Okay.
No.
I get a multiple choice. Now, this is really interesting. Obviously, a company everybody knows. So I should know the farmers. So let me go to medical companies.
It doesn't have to be pharma. That's my clue. It does not have to be pharma.
No. That's what I thought. It probably wouldn't be because. Okay, let me take a wild swing here. Medtronic.
Oh, no, but good guess. The answer is Amazon.
Oh,
Amazon for the first 2 years was known as Cadabra.
Wow, interesting. I did not know. But it goes to show some companies really fly under the radar and then they take off. This is a good example. Absolutely. Really wow. No, thanks for educating me.
There you go. You can take that with you.
So now I understand. Right. I'm turning the tables now on you, right?
That's right. I'm here to learn.
Okay, so I'm disclosing herewith that my wife grew up in Wisconsin, right? And obviously I grew up in Europe, so I learned by becoming also an American that every state is really big on like symbols and things. So obviously there would be state birds and stuff. But I want to ask you, what is the unofficial state bird of Wisconsin?
Well, I lived in Wisconsin for 12 years, and I might have a pretty good guess. It's the unofficial bird of Wisconsin. Is it the mosquito?
You got it.
Yes. And I'll tell you, so right now I live in Minnesota, and it's also the unofficial bird of Minnesota as well.
Oh, it is.
Yes,
How
we're
do you know
just
that?
about to start mosquito season here, so that
Oh my
it's
gosh.
been on my mind.
That's
Super.
actually kind of nice with all the rivalries in sports. That here's a kind of a
It's a
a
unifier.
bond. Yeah, exactly. It's a bond that unifies people up there in the upper Midwest.
That's right. That's right. Our hatred of mosquitoes. Great question. I loved it.
For sure.
That was fantastic. So it's always fun to wrap up the podcast with a little bit of fun. I'd like to thank our guest today, Mathias Romacker. To prepare for the future, we need to know where we've come from. And I thank you, Mathias, for walking us through the evolution of both parenterals and the PDA. I'd also like to thank our listeners for learning with us, and I look forward to discovering more with you on the next episode of Machines in Medicine. Goodbye.